On the morning of September 7th, 1191, the Holy Land trembled as if it understood what was about to unfold. For 7 relentless days, the Crusader army, 12,000 men baked in armor, lips cracked from thirst, shields splintered by thousands of arrows, had been pushed to the very edge of human endurance. And yet, in just 17 minutes, these same exhausted warriors would turn and obliterate 30,000 of Saladin's finest troops in one of the most unthinkable reversals in medieval history, a kill ratio of 10 to 1. 7,000 Muslim dead, and the myth of Saladin's invincibility, built over years of victories, shattered in the dust. But those 17 minutes didn't appear out of nowhere. Their roots were planted 1 week earlier, when 2 of the greatest commanders the medieval world had ever known began the final, most dangerous game of their lives. On one side stood Richard the Lionheart, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, a man who had spent his entire life fighting, conquering, and commanding. At only 33, he had already earned a reputation as Europe's most terrifying warrior king. His latest achievement, capturing Acre after a brutal 2-year siege, had electrified Christendom. On the other side stood Saladin, 53 years old, Sultan of Egypt and Syria, the man who had retaken Jerusalem, broken the Crusader kingdoms, and crushed the Christian army at Hattin, one of the worst defeats in crusading history. He was calm, patient, ruthless when needed, and unmatched in the art of mobile warfare. The Third Crusade now hung between these 2 men, balanced on a razor's edge. Richard's discipline versus Saladin's mobility. Richard's patience versus Saladin's pressure. Richard's endurance versus Saladin's numbers. After Acre, Richard made a choice that would determine everything. He marched south along the coast toward Jaffa. It was predictable, even cautious, and Saladin was delighted. That coastal road was a natural death trap, an 80-mile strip where the Crusaders would be squeezed between the open sea and the rising hills. There would be no room to maneuver, nowhere to retreat, nowhere to escape the storms of arrows that Saladin's cavalry could unleash at will. Both commanders studied each other. Both believed they knew what the other would do. Both thought they understood the game. But neither one realized that what mattered most in the days ahead wasn't courage, or numbers, or even strategy. It was discipline. Discipline stretched until it screamed. Discipline hardened into something unbreakable. And that discipline was about to decide the fate of the Holy Land. Richard the Lionheart did not command a large army, but what he commanded was elite. His 12,000 men were the hardened spine of the Third Crusade. At the core stood 2,000 mounted knights, the most fearsome shock troops Europe could produce. In the front rode 300 Hospitallers, grim and disciplined, their black cloaks marked with stark white crosses. In the rear marched 300 Templars, the iron hammer of Christendom, sworn to die before they broke formation. Between them rode 1,400 additional knights from England, Normandy, France, and the Crusader states. Supporting the cavalry were 10,000 infantry, half spearmen forming thick shield walls, half crossbowmen whose bolts could punch through armor at extraordinary range. And yet none of these weapons defined Richard's army as much as the formation he drilled into them. A moving defensive box, shifting and turning like a single armored beast, shields overlapped. Spears bristled outward. Crossbowmen fired from within, protected by layers of steel and discipline. It was not merely a formation. It was a fortress that marched. Saladin's host, however, was the mirror opposite, fast, flexible, and overwhelming in number. He commanded roughly 30,000 warriors, built not to withstand a single crushing blow, but to bleed an enemy to death over miles of terrain. At its heart were 10,000 Mamluk cavalry, the finest horsemen in the Islamic world, men raised from childhood for war, trained to master the bow, the saber, and the desert itself. Flowing around them were 20,000 others, Bedouin light cavalry who could vanish into dust, Turkish horse archers who could fire at full gallop, Kurdish infantry, Egyptian regulars, an army designed to swarm, exhaust, terrify. And Saladin's greatest weapons weren't steel or arrows. They were psychological. Drums that shook a man's courage, cymbals that shattered focus, dust clouds that blinded sight and choked lungs. Endless streams of arrows meant not to kill, but to wear down resolve, piece by piece, hour by hour. The landscape near Arsuf only multiplied his advantage, the open sea trapping the Crusaders on their right, the hills looming on their left. A 10-mile gauntlet where Saladin's cavalry could strike, vanish, and strike again. He planned to bleed Richard slowly, waiting for the knights to crack, for discipline to snap, and then deliver the killing blow. But Richard had read the terrain, read the tactics, and read Saladin himself. If Saladin intended to turn suffering into a weapon, Richard intended to turn suffering into a trap. The march toward Arsuf began on September 3rd, and from the very first hour, hell opened its gates. As Richard's army pulled away from Acre, the initial arrows began to fall, not in thunderous volleys, but in a slow, steady drizzle meant to break nerves, not bodies. It was psychological warfare at its purest. Constant pressure, constant dread, constant reminder that the enemy was watching Saladin's cavalry, danced along the hills like ghosts. They appeared suddenly in the shimmering heat, loosed their arrows and vanished before the Crusader. Crossbowmen could even raise their weapons. Richard kept his forces locked in a rigid structure, Hospitallers in front, the royal standard in the center, Templars in the rear. Every man knew his place, every man understood the stakes. There would be no charging, no matter how tempting the open desert seemed. Richard's order was ironclad: no attack without 3 trumpet blasts. Breaking formation meant destruction, whether at the hands of Saladin's horsemen or by Richard's own justice. And so the army endured. As the days dragged on, the suffering became biblical. Temperatures soared past 115 degrees Fahrenheit, turning metal armor into scorching ovens. Water skins emptied faster than they could be refilled. Horses stumbled and collapsed, foam bubbling from their mouths. Shields bristled with arrows, each shaft vibrating with the impact of another near miss. Men marched with trembling legs, lips split from heat, vision blurring under the relentless sun. On the 5th day, the pressure reached a grotesque new level. The Templars in the rear were forced to ride backward in their saddles, facing the enemy, while squires led their horses forward. It was humiliating, but tactically brilliant. No Muslim archer dared approach the silent, staring wall of steel. By the 6th day, the Hospitallers were at their breaking point. Their commander, Master Garnier de Nablus, watched man after man fall without being allowed to strike back. Rage simmered inside him like molten iron. Richard felt it too, the tension, the pressure, the boiling fury spreading through the ranks. And he welcomed it. He needed Saladin to think the Crusaders were collapsing. He needed the Sultan to commit everything. Because discipline, stretched nearly to the point of madness, was about to become Richard's deadliest weapon. By September 6th, Saladin understood the terrifying truth. Richard's army, battered, sunburned, and running on sheer will, was only 5 miles from the fortified camp at Arsuf. If the Crusaders reached it, they would be safe, and Saladin's chance to crush the Third Crusade would evaporate forever. He had 1 day left to break them, so he committed everything. At dawn on September 7th, the hills erupted. From the ridge lines poured 30,000 warriors, descending like a dark living tide. Saladin unleashed his army in 3 massive wings. 8,000 cavalry under Taqi al-Din, on the right 10,000 elite Mamluks in the center. Commanded by Saladin himself, 8,000 cavalry under Muzaffar al-Din on the left. Thousands more waiting behind as reserves. The desert shook with the sound. Drums thundered like rolling thunder. Cymbals crashed in metallic bursts. Arrows filled the sky until the sun dimmed behind them. The first assault smashed into the rear of Richard's column, where the Templars braced under the blow. The impact was brutal. Shields shook. Horses screamed. The air was thick with dust, sweat, and the whistle of arrows tearing through it. Richard's formation held, but it was being pushed to the edge, and then the moment that would ignite the entire battle arrived. Taqi al-Din himself, Saladin's nephew, a veteran commander, spurred his horse forward and led a furious charge straight at the Hospitaller banner. It wasn't just a tactical strike. It was a deliberate humiliation, a personal insult meant to shatter the Hospitallers' iron discipline and provoke them into a reckless counterattack. And it worked. The Hospitallers had suffered for 7 straight days without being allowed to strike back. They had marched under blistering heat, endured endless arrow storms, watched their brothers fall beside them with no chance of revenge. Their rage was a living thing, boiling, strangling, ready to explode. Taqi al-Din's charge was the spark that finally touched the powder. In the next moments, the fragile thread of restraint would snap. The desert would erupt. 17 minutes of hell were about to begin. For 7 days, the Hospitallers had endured the unimaginable. Heat like a furnace, arrows raining endlessly, comrades collapsing beside them with no chance to strike back. Their discipline had held, barely. But on the morning of September 7th, that discipline finally shattered. Master Garnier de Nablus snapped under the deafening roar of drums and the storm of arrows. He saw Taqi al-Din's cavalry tear toward the Hospitaller banner, mocking their restraint, daring them to break. Rage flooded through him like wildfire. "I can bear this no longer," he roared. Before any officer could react, Garnier slammed down his visor, couched his lance, and charged. His Hospitaller knights followed instinctively. 300 war horses exploding forward as one. Sand blasted into the air. Shields rattled. The disciplined march disintegrated into a furious, unauthorized attack. For a heartbeat, the battlefield froze. Richard saw it instantly. The one thing he had forbidden now unfolding before his eyes. His options were deadly in both directions. Call them back, and those 300 knights would be swallowed alive by Saladin's far larger force, or commit everything and gamble the fate of the entire crusade on a single moment. Richard had 3 seconds to choose. 3 seconds to decide the future of the Holy Land. 3 seconds to decide whether his army lived or died. Great commanders reveal themselves in such moments. Richard didn't hesitate. He stood in his stirrups, raised his arm high, and gave the order his army had prayed for during 7 days of torment. "Sound the trumpets!" 3 long blasts tore across the battlefield. The signal, the release, the moment the Crusaders had been starved for. The entire mounted force, Templars, Hospitallers, English, French, 2,000 armored knights in total, launched forward in a perfectly timed, perfectly aligned charge. The earth trembled beneath the weight of charging destriers. The sea roared as if echoing the fury. The desert itself seemed to thunder. Richard had taken a disaster and turned it into opportunity. The most devastating cavalry strike of the Middle Ages had begun, and nothing on earth could stop it now. What happened next was so sudden, so overwhelming, that many eyewitnesses later insisted it felt less like a battle and more like the laws of nature breaking apart. The moment Richard unleashed the full Crusader charge, the desert transformed. Thousands of war horses surged forward at full gallop, the combined weight of horse, armor, and rider turning each knight into a living projectile. At nearly 35 miles per hour, the impact was closer to a modern collision than medieval combat. Saladin's lighter, faster cavalry, so effective in skirmishes, had never faced anything like this. The front of the Muslim line didn't simply break, it erupted. Lances splintered the instant they struck, but the knights did not slow. In one fluid motion, they dropped shattered shafts and drew their swords, momentum carrying them straight through the chaos. Even the war horses seemed transformed, trained for this very moment, charging with a ferocity that sent waves of panic racing through Saladin's formations. The Hospitaller wedge, driven by 7 days of pent-up fury, tore straight through Taqi al-Din's right wing, scattering seasoned cavalry as though the desert floor had opened beneath them. In the center, Richard himself led the English and French knights, plunging directly into the Mamluk elite, Saladin's pride, his most battle-hardened warriors. On the left, the Templars executed a flawless maneuver, swinging inward to form a crushing hammer and anvil trap that collapsed the Muslim flank across the field. A terrifying transformation took place. Drums that had thundered all week fell silent. Commands dissolved into confusion, and fear, once kept tightly leashed, swept through the ranks like wildfire. Saladin watched the center of his army buckle, then fold entirely. His bodyguard moved quickly, pulling him away as the battlefield unraveled around him. The great commander who had conquered Jerusalem now faced something he had never seen. A fully coordinated, perfectly timed charge delivered with absolute discipline. From the very first impact to the total collapse of his line, only 17 minutes passed. When the desert wind settled, 30,000 men were in flight, and the core of Saladin's military strength had evaporated. In those 17 minutes, the balance of the Crusades shifted forever. When the dust finally settled over Arsuf, every Crusader in the line believed they knew what would happen next. The enemy was broken, their formations scattered, their morale shattered. Saladin himself had barely escaped with his life. To the Crusaders, one course seemed obvious: pursue, finish the job, and drive straight to Jerusalem. But Richard the Lionheart saw what his men could not. The knight's armor hung on them like molten iron. Their horses trembled beneath them, lungs heaving, muscles quivering from the 17-minute thunderstorm of violence they had just unleashed. The infantry staggered like men walking out of a furnace. The battlefield was a graveyard, hot, silent, and littered with the remains of an army that would never rise again. Richard understood something simple and terrifying. Victory had been earned through discipline, and now discipline was the only thing that could keep that victory from turning into disaster. So when his commanders begged him to chase the fleeing enemy, to crush Saladin once and for all, Richard refused. Calmly, absolutely. His voice carried across the wind. "We hold, we reform." The men were stunned. Some were angry, but none dared disobey. Richard ordered water for the surviving horses, bandages for the wounded, rest for the exhausted. The dead were gathered, the ranks were rebuilt. And then, with a cold, methodical precision, he marched the army not after Saladin, but toward Arsuf, securing it before turning south to Jaffa, which surrendered without a single sword drawn. Across the Levant, the shock was immediate. For years, Saladin had seemed unbeatable. His victories at Hattin and Jerusalem had turned him into a living legend. But Arsuf killed more than 7,000 of his men. It killed his aura. Fortresses that once swore eternal resistance now hesitated. Commanders who once shouted confidence now whispered doubts. And Saladin, who had once vowed to drive every Frank into the sea, now sent envoys to Richard, seeking terms, truce, anything to stop the bleeding. The battle was over, but the psychological wound it carved into the Muslim world would take years to heal. Richard hadn't just won a victory, he had rewritten fear, and fear travels farther than any army. The Battle of Arsuf did far more than shatter an army. It rewrote the rules of medieval warfare. For centuries, commanders believed that fast, mobile forces would always wear down heavy cavalry. Arsuf proved the opposite. When discipline held, when timing was perfect, and when a commander understood patience as deeply as he understood steel, even a smaller force could strike with world-shaking power. Richard the Lionheart demonstrated a truth few had dared to imagine. Heavy cavalry, if restrained and released at the exact moment, was unstoppable. He showed that discipline could become a weapon sharper than any sword. He showed that suffering could be transformed into strategy. And he showed that numbers meant nothing if one side controlled the timing of the fight. For generations after Arsuf, European generals studied Richard's maneuvers, his three-line marching formation, his controlled use of cavalry wedges, his tactical patience under fire. They became textbook principles in castles, war schools, and royal courts. Even modern strategists continue referencing Arsuf as an example of how to lure a powerful enemy into overcommitting before striking with concentrated force. On the other side, the psychological shock to Saladin's world was permanent. The Sultan never again engaged the Crusaders in an open-field battle. He shifted entirely to sieges, diplomacy, and controlled engagements. The memory of those 17 minutes, where the center of his army dissolved before his eyes, changed his strategy forever. And Richard, he earned the title Lionheart not because he charged recklessly, but because he held back for 7 agonizing days. Because he endured thirst, heat, and humiliation. Because he mastered his own anger and the anger of thousands of men, until the exact heartbeat when release would become victory. At Arsuf, he didn't merely defeat Saladin's army, he shattered a doctrine. He closed a chapter of military history, and he reminded the world that in war, as in life, victory belongs not to the strongest, but to the one who chooses the perfect moment to strike.